Arthur Conan Doyle, the pastor at Jackman's Gulch. In the Gulch, he was known as a reverend. Everyone knew, however, that this was not due to any legal claim on Hopkins' part, but rather a title of honor bestowed upon him by the inhabitants for his many virtues. He had also earned the nickname the pastor, a distinctive title for a man living on a continent where the flock was scattered to winds and shepherds were few and far between. To give the Reverend Elias B. Hopkins his due, he never once claimed to have any formal theological education or any other training that would qualify him for the ministry. "Each of us toils in the plot of land assigned to us by our Lord," he once remarked. "Whether we work for hire or dance to our own tune matters not in the least." The rugged imagery of this statement struck a chord perfectly with the instinct of the men at Jackman's Gulch. There is no doubt that during his first few months in the Gulch, there was a marked decrease in consumption of hard spirits and the use of even harder epithets. Under his guidance, the miners began to realize that the possibilities of their mother tongue were less limited than they had supposed, and that the precision of one's expression suffered little when stripped of flowery blasphemies and curses. At the beginning of 1853, we, the inhabitants of the Gulch, though we did not know it, were in dire need of a teacher capable of setting us on the right path. The entire colony was booming, but nowhere were the miners more fortunate than in our camp, and this material prosperity had begun to rot our public morals. Our settlement was small, situated over 120 miles north of Ballarat, in a winding ravine through which a mountain stream flows into the Arrowsmith River. Tradition has left us no record of the Jackman for whom the place was named. At the time of this story, the population consisted of about 100 grown men. Many had sought refuge here after the climate of more civilized towns proved unfavorable to their health. It was a rough, hardened rabble, only slightly diluted by the few decent citizens whom fate occasionally cast into the Gulch. Communication between Jackman's Gulch and the outside world was neither simple nor secure. The forest stretching between our settlement and Ballarat was the domain of a formidable outlaw known as Nosey Jim, who held sway with a small gang of cutthroats as desperate as himself. Thus, a journey to Ballarat was no safe undertaking. It was customary to store the nuggets and gold dust found by the miners in a special warehouse. Each man's share was kept in a separate bag marked with the owner's name. The duties of guarding this primitive bank were entrusted to a man named Woburn. When a significant amount of gold had accumulated, the entire treasure would be loaded into a chartered wagon and escorted to Ballarat under protection of the police and a number of miners who took turns performing this duty. From Ballarat, the gold was regularly dispatched to Melbourne. Although the gold sometimes remained in the Gulch for months before shipment, Nosey Jim's criminal plans were effectively thwarted, as the escort was always too large for his gang to handle. At the time of this narrative, Nosey Jim had apparently given up and left the district, allowing travelers to use the road in small groups without fear. During the day, a relative order reigned over the settlement, as the majority of the inhabitants were busy crushing quartz reefs with picks and crowbars, or washing clay and sand in pans along the creek bank. But as sunset approached, the claims would gradually empty. Their unkempt owners, splattered with clay and slush, would trudge back toward the camp, ripe for almost any kind of mischief. Their first stop was always Woburn's warehouse to deposit the day's findings. The exact amount was duly entered into a ledger, though every miner kept back a small portion of gold to cover his evening expenses. Once that business was concluded, they set about spending their remaining dust with all the speed and abandon they could muster. The magnetic center of the settlement's evening life was a crude counter made of planks laid across two large barrels. This structure was grandly titled the Britannia Drinking Bar. Here, the stout barman, Nat Adams, dispensed vile whiskey at 2 shillings a tot or a guinea a bottle, while his brother Ben acted as croupier in the shabby lean-to adjoining the bar, a space converted into a gambling den that was packed to the rafters every night. There had once been a third Adams brother, but an unfortunate misunderstanding with a customer had brought his life to a premature end. He was just too polite to live long, his brother Nathaniel remarked feelingly at the funeral. How many times did I tell him, if you're going to argue with a stranger over the price of a pint, draw your piece first and talk later. And if you see him reaching for his revolver, shoot first or don't shoot at all. The late Bill's noble delicacy proved a financial blow to the Adams firm. Finding themselves short-handed after his passing, They were forced to take on an outside partner, which led to a significant dip in the family concern's profits. Nat Adams had owned his roadside shanty in the Gulch long before gold was ever discovered there, and on that basis, he could claim the title of the settlement's oldest inhabitant. Roadside shanty keepers are a peculiar breed of men. It may be worth a brief digression from our main story to observe just how they managed to amass such significant fortunes in rural districts where customers were so few and far between. The bushmen, in other words, the bullock drivers, shepherds, and other white laborers on the Australian sheep stations, usually sign a contract. By its terms, they agree to serve a master for a year, or perhaps 2 or 3, for a fixed sum of pounds sterling and a specific ration of tucker. Spirits are never mentioned in these agreements. Thus, during their entire term of service, the men are forced to keep a vow of sobriety. Their wages are paid in a lump sum only when their time is up. Then comes payday. Jimmy, a station hand, enters the master's office with a stoop, clutching his cabbage tree hat. "Morning, boss," says Jimmy. "Looks like my time's about up. I reckon I'll take my check and head into town. Will you be coming back, Jimmy?" "Right enough, I'll be back. Maybe in 3 weeks, maybe a month. Need to buy some new duds. And these cursed boots are falling right off my feet." "How much, Jimmy?" the master asks, picking up a pen. £60 for the wages, Jimmy answers thoughtfully. "And remember, boss, when that brindle bull broke out of the yard, you promised me £2, another pound for the sheep washing. And there's the pound I earned when Miller's sheep got mixed with ours." Jimmy goes on for some time. The men of the bush can rarely write, but their memories are unerring. The master draws the check and hands it over. "Don't go too hard on the drink, Jimmy," he offers as a parting word. "Don't you worry, boss." Jimmy tucks the check into a leather pouch, and within the hour, he is jogging along on his long-legged horse toward the town, 100 miles away. During the day, he must pass 6 or 8 of those roadside shanties. He knows from experience that he must not break his long fast from spirits under any circumstances. A single drink, after such a long abstinence, would instantly shatter his resolve and cloud his brain. Jimmy shakes his head sensibly, vowing that not for all the tea in China will he touch a drop until his business in town is finished. The only way to keep his word is to avoid temptation entirely. Knowing the first shanty is just half a mile ahead, Jimmy turns his horse onto a forest track to bypass the danger zone. Determined to keep his vow, he rides along the narrow path, already congratulating himself on his escape. Suddenly, he spots a tanned, black-bearded man leaning lazily against a tree by the trail. It is none other than the shanty keeper. He had spotted Jimmy's flanking maneuver from afar and cut straight through the scrub to intercept him. "Good day, Jimmy," he shouts as the traveler pulls up. "Good day, mate, good day." "Heading far?" "To town," says the steadfast Jimmy. "Is that so? Well, I wish you luck and a grand time. Won't you step inside for just one glass to toast your journey?" "No," Jimmy says. "I'm not drinking. Just one little glass." "I told you I don't want any," the shepherd snaps back. Well, no need to get riled. It's all the same to me whether you drink or not. Safe travels." "Safe travels," Jimmy replies. But he hasn't ridden 20 paces before he hears the publican calling him back. "Listen, Jimmy," the man says, catching up again. "I'd be much obliged if you'd do me a small favor in town." "What is it?" "I need to send a letter. It's a very important letter, and I can't just trust it to any stranger. I know you, and if you'd take charge of it, it would be a huge weight off my mind." "Give it here," says Jimmy curtly. "I haven't got it on me. It's back at the hut. Come along with me. It's right close by, not a quarter mile." Jimmy reluctantly agrees. When they reach the ramshackle hut, the publican invites the shepherd to dismount and step inside. "Give me the letter," Jimmy urges. "You see, it's not quite finished, but I'll have it done in a jiffy. Just take a seat for a moment." And so, the shepherd is lured into the bar. At last, the letter is ready and handed over. "Now, then, Jimmy," says the publican, "have one for the road on the house." "Not a single drop," says Jimmy. "Oh, is that so?" The publican's tone is one of deep offense. "You're so cursed proud you won't drink with a man like me? In that case, give me back my letter. I'll be triple damned if I accept a favor from a man who's too good to have a drink with me. All right, don't get riled, says Jimmy. Fine, then. Pour a glass and I'll be off. The publican hands him a tin pannikin, half filled with raw rum. The moment Jimmy catches a familiar scent, his resolve vanishes, and he drains the cup in a single gulp. A spark leaps into his eyes. A flush warms his cheeks. The publican watches him narrowly. You can go now, Jim, he says. Easy, mate, easy, the shepherd replies. I'm as good a man as you. If you're treating, I can treat back. The pannikin is filled again, and Jimmy's eyes burn brighter still. Well, Jimmy, one last one for good house, says the publican. It's time you were moving. The shepherd drinks for the third time, and with that third swallow, all his caution and good intentions evaporate. Listen, he says in a husky voice, pulling the check from his pouch. Take this, mate. Invite everyone who comes down the road to drink to my health. Whatever they want, as much as they want. When it's all spent, let me know. And Jimmy, abandoning all thought of ever reaching town, spends the next 3 or 4 weeks slumped in the shanty in a state of profound intoxication, bringing every passing traveler down to his own level. One fine morning, the publican says to him, The coin's run out, Jimmy. Time you headed back to work. After which Jimmy douses himself with water to sober up, swings his blanket and billykin over his back, mounts his horse, and returns to the station, where another year of sobriety awaits him, inevitably ending in another month of mindless ruin. All this, while typical of the reckless Australian way of life, has no direct bearing on Jackman's Gulch. We must return to our idol. The population of the Gulch was rarely increased by outsiders. The fortune-seekers who arrived during the period of my story were, if anything, even more ferocious and coarse than the old-timers. Particularly rowdy were Phillips and Mall, 2 cutthroats who arrived one day and staked a claim on the far side of the creek. In the malice and virtuosity of their blasphemies, the crudeness of their speech, and their daring contempt for every social norm, they outdid the original inhabitants. They claimed to have come from Bendigo, and more than one of us thought it might not be such a bad thing if Nosy Jim reappeared to close the road against newcomers like these 2. After their arrival, the nightly gatherings at the Britannia and the gambling held behind it became even more riotous. Wild quarrels, often ending in bloody brawls, became a daily occurrence. The more peaceable regulars began to talk seriously of lynching the 2 strangers, the primary instigators of the disorder. Such was the lamentable state of the camp when our evangelist, Elias B. Hopkins, appeared, limping, dusty, his feet blistered from the long journey, a shovel slung over his back, and a Bible in the pocket of his moleskin jacket. He was such an unremarkable man that, at first, hardly any of us noticed his presence. His manner was quiet and modest. His face was pale and his frame frail. However, a clean-shaven chin spoke of firmness, and wide-set blue eyes betrayed a keen intelligence, qualities that, upon closer acquaintance, revealed a man of strong character. He built himself a tiny hut and staked a claim near the workings occupied by the newcomers, Phillips and Mall. His choice defied every practical rule of mining. It was so flagrantly absurd that he was instantly branded a greenhorn. Every morning, as we headed to our own claims, we watched with pity as he dug and hammered with immense diligence, despite having, as we well knew, not the slightest chance of success. Sometimes, spotting us passing by, he would pause a moment to wipe his pale face with a polka-dot handkerchief, give us a hearty and soulful good morning, and then resume his work with redoubled energy. Little by little, it became the custom to inquire, partly out of pity, partly with condescension, how his search for gold was faring. "Haven't found it yet, boys," he would answer cheerfully, leaning on his spade. "But the bedrock is close now, and I reckon today's the day we hit the lead." Day after day, he gave us the same answer with the same brisk confidence. Soon enough, Hopkins began to show us the metal he was made of. One evening, the atmosphere in the drinking bar was unusually riotous. A rich vein had been struck on the claims that day, and the lucky miner was standing drinks for everyone, leaving 3/4 of the population of the Gulch in a state of roaring intoxication. Drunkards milled about aimlessly or sprawled near the counter, blaspheming, brawling, shouting, dancing, or firing their revolvers into the air just for the sake of the noise. Similar sounds drifted from the gambling den. Maul, Phillips, and their cronies set the tone. Order and decency had been swept away entirely. Suddenly, amidst the brawling, the cursing, and the drunken yells, people began to distinguish a low, monotonous voice. It seemed to serve as a background to all other noises, cutting through every lull in the drunken clamor. Little by little, the men fell silent to listen, until at last the din died down completely, and every eye turned toward the source of those quiet words. There, perched atop a barrel, sat the newest inhabitant of Jackman's Gulch, Elias B. Hopkins, with a mild smile on his resolute face. In his hand, he held an open Bible, reading aloud from a passage in Revelation, if my memory serves. The text was entirely random and had not the slightest connection to the scenes in the bar, but Hopkins read it with an air of pious diligence, his left hand swaying slightly in time with the sentences. This performance was met with a roar of laughter and applause from the men of the Gulch. They crowded around the barrel with approving murmurs, believing they were witnessing some elaborate prank and expecting a parody sermon or mock lecture. The reader, however, finished his chapter and serenely began another. When he finished that one and moved to the next, the revelers decided the joke was wearing thin. By the time Hopkins started yet another chapter, they were certain of it. From all sides, fierce shouts arose, calling for the reader to shut his trap or be knocked off his barrel. Ignoring the jeers and hooting, Elias B. Hopkins doggedly continued his reading of the Apocalypse, maintaining an unruffled and satisfied look, as if the surrounding uproar were more pleasing to him than any applause. Soon, a tossed boot struck the barrel with a loud thud, then another, while a third whistled past the new pastor's head. At this point, the more orderly miners stepped in to defend peace and quiet. Curiously, they were joined by the aforementioned Maul and Phillips, who took the side of frail scripture reader. Hopkins is a right enough sort, Phillips explained, his hulking frame and its red shirt shielding the object of the crowd's anger. He's a different breed than us, but he's entitled to his opinions and to air them on a barrel or anywhere else if he's so minded. It's a poor business throwing boots where words will do. If anyone lays a finger on the little man, Maul, I will step in and give him what for. Phillips' eloquence stifled the most open displays of resentment. Those eager for trouble tried to resume their interrupted drinking, attempting to ignore the torrent of scripture being poured over them. But it was a hopeless endeavor. The drunkest among them fell asleep to the monotonous murmur. Others, casting dark looks at the reader who sat on his barrel as if nothing had happened, decided to head back to their huts. When only the quietest members of the crowd remained, Hopkins stood up, closed his book, meticulously marking his place with a pencil, and climbed down. "Tomorrow night, boys," he announced in a quiet voice, "I shall resume at the 9th verse of the 15th chapter of Revelation." And, paying no mind to our congratulations, he withdrew with the air of a man who had fulfilled a sacred duty. It turned out his words were no idle threat. The next evening, as soon as the crowd began to gather in the bar, he was back on his barrel, doggedly droning through the Bible, stumbling and swallowing whole sentences, but not without effort, plowing through chapter after chapter. Laughter, threats, and mockery. Every weapon short of direct violence was used to stop him, but all proved equally futile. Soon, we noticed a certain method in his actions. As long as silence reigned or the conversation remained innocent, Hopkins was silent. But the moment a single blasphemy was uttered, the Bible reading would resume for about 15 minutes. He would then fall quiet, but at the slightest provocation of an oath or a curse, he would start up again. The following night, he read almost without pause, for the language used by the opposition was still quite free, though not nearly as much as the night before. Elias B. Hopkins maintained his campaign for over a month. Every single evening, there he sat, an open book upon his knee, ready, like a musical box at the touch of a spring, to begin his work at the slightest provocation. His monotonous drone became unbearable. The only way to escape it was to adhere to the code of conduct proposed by the newfound pastor. The community began to look upon chronic swearers with stern disapproval, for the punishment for their transgressions fell upon everyone. By the end of the second week, the reader remained mostly silent, and by the end of the month, his post had become a sinecure. Never before had a revolution of morals occurred so swiftly or so completely. Our pastor carried his principles into everyday life as well. One might see him, upon hearing an incautious word uttered in anger by some minor, rush toward the offender, Bible in hand. Scrambling atop the mound of red clay rising above the sinner's claim, he would drone, from the first letter to the last, the entire genealogical tree from the beginning of the Old Testament. He did this with an air so solemn and impressive one might think the passage had a direct and vital bearing on the situation at hand. In time, an oath became a rarity among us, and drunkenness, too, began to wane. Passing travelers, drifting through the Gulch, were struck with wonder. Whence came this sudden piety in which we lived? Rumors of it reached as far as Ballarat, sparking all manner of gossip and speculation. Certain traits inherent in Hopkins contributed immensely to the success of the mission he had taken upon himself. A man entirely without sin could never have found a common ground necessary to win the sympathies of such a flock. As we came to know Elias B. Hopkins better, we discovered that, for all his piety, the leaven of the old sinner would occasionally show through, suggesting that in the past, our pastor's path had not always diverged from the ways of vice. He was no teetotaler. On the contrary, he chose his spirits with great discernment and tossed back a glass with a practiced hand. At poker, he was a master, and few could best him at euchre without losing their very shirt. In the company of the former troublemakers Phillips and Mall, he would play for hours in perfect harmony, unless an unlucky hand wrung a curse from one of his less restrained partners. At the first offense, a pained smile would flicker across the pastor's face, and he would cast a reproachful look at the guilty party. At the second, he would reach for his Bible, and the game was over for the night. We also discovered that he was a superb marksman. One day, as we were practicing outside Adam's bar, firing at an empty brandy bottle, the pastor took a revolver from one of us and planted a bullet squarely in the center of the bottle from a distance of 24 paces. Indeed, whatever he turned his hand to, he did with a skill that was a pleasure to behold. Except, that is, for the mining of gold. He was quite simply the most wretched prospector in all of Australia. His linen bag, sitting on the shelf of Woburn's warehouse with his name in block letters, was a pathetic sight. It lay untouched and empty, while the bags of other miners grew daily, many achieving a substantial roundness. The weeks flew by, and the time drew near for the gold wagon to depart for Ballarat. By our calculations, the warehouse held more gold than had ever been escorted from Jackman's Gulch at a single time. Although Elias B. Hopkins was clearly, in his own quiet way, pleased with the miraculous change he had wrought in our camp, his satisfaction was not quite complete. Something was missing for his ultimate happiness, and one fine evening, he opened his heart to us. A blessing from the Lord would truly descend upon this camp, boys, he said, if we could organize some kind of church service on Sundays. We do nothing to mark the Sabbath, save for drinking more whiskey and playing more cards than on weekdays. To continue in such a fashion is to tempt Providence. But we have no parson, someone in the crowd objected. Quiet, you fool, a neighbor growled at him. Haven't we a man who's worth 3 parsons? Scripture spills out of him like clay from a pan. What more do you want? We have no church, the first man persisted. We could hold the service under the open sky, someone else suggested. Or in Woburn's warehouse, the crowd chimed in. Or in Adam's saloon. This last suggestion was met with a hum of approval. It seemed the majority considered the saloon the most fitting venue. Once the tables and furniture were cleared out, it proved spacious enough to hold the entire population of the Gulch. The owners stacked the liquor barrels at one end of the room in such a way that they formed a sort of makeshift preacher's pulpit. At first, these preparations didn't stir much enthusiasm among the men of the Gulch. But when word got out that Elias B. Hopkins intended to address the public with a speech after the service, interest spiked. A real sermon was a novelty to the miners, and one delivered by their own pastor seemed doubly intriguing. Rumors flew that the sermon would be seasoned with local examples, its morals sharpened by pointed jabs at certain well-known characters. People began to fear they wouldn't get a seat, and the Adams brothers were swamped with requests to reserve places. Only after repeated assurances that there was more than enough room for everyone did the camp settle down to wait for ceremony in peace. The spaciousness of the saloon turned out to be a blessing, as the gathering that Sunday morning was the largest in the history of Jackman's Gulch. At first, it was thought that every soul in the settlement had moved in one mass, but it later appeared this wasn't quite the case. Moll and Phillips, it turned out, had headed into the hills the evening before prospect for new gold-bearing reefs, and had not yet returned. Woburn, the custodian of the gold, also stayed behind. An unprecedented amount of treasure had been committed to his care, and he remained at his post, feeling his responsibility was too great to be distracted by trifles. With the exception of those three, every inhabitant of the Gulch, decked out in clean red shirts and whatever finery they possessed, moved in steady, rambling groups along the clay path leading to the saloon. Inside, benches had been hastily knocked together, and the pastor stood by the door, greeting everyone with a genial smile. "Morning, boys," he welcomed each approaching group. Come in. You won't regret coming today. Just drop your pistols in that barrel by the door. You can pick 'em up when we're through. It's not fitting to carry iron into a house of peace." His request was obediently followed. Before the last parishioner had even entered, the storage barrel held an unparalleled collection of blades and firearms. When everyone was assembled, the saloon doors were shut, and the service began, the first and the last in Jackman's Gulch. The weather was sweltering, and the air inside was stifling, but the miners listened with exemplary attention. There was a pull of the unusual in the situation that was hard to resist. For some, it was their first church service. For others, it brought back memories of different lands and different times. Aside from a tendency for the uninitiated to applaud at the end of certain prayers to show their approval, no congregation could have behaved more decorously. However, when Elias B. Hopkins looked down at us from his barrel pulpit and began his address, a murmur of intrigue ran through the room. For the solemn occasion, Hopkins had dressed with particular care. He wore moleskin trousers and a velvet blouse cinched with a sash of Chinese silk. In his left hand, he held his cabbage tree hat. He began his speech in a low voice, frequently glancing, as we noticed, at a small opening that served as a window above the heads of the crowd. "I have set you upon the right path," he declared. "With my help, you are now in the proper groove, and you're sticking to it." After these words, he stared very intently out of the window for several seconds. "You have learned sobriety and industry, which will always help you make up for any losses that may fall to your lot. I don't think a single one of you will ever forget my stay in this camp." He paused. In the quiet summer air, 3 revolver shots rang out. "Sit down, damn you!" the preacher's voice thundered, as the startled crowd scrambled to their feet at the sound of the shots. "The first man to move is a dead man. The doors are locked from the outside, and you're not getting out. Sit down, you snub-nosed saints. Down, you dogs, or I'll fire." In amazement and terror, we sank back into our seats, staring blankly at our pastor and at each other. Elias B. Hopkins, whose face and very figure seemed to have undergone a terrifying metamorphosis, glared down at us from his dominant position. A contemptuous sneer played across his lips. "Your lives are in my hands," he remarked. And only then did we see that he held a large revolver in his hand, while a second handle jutted from beneath his silk sash. "I am armed, and you are not," he stated. "The first man to stir or speak dies on the spot. Sit still, and I shall not lay a finger on you. You are to remain here for 1 hour. You fools." The contemptuous hiss with which he uttered those words would ring in our ears for days to come. "I reckon you haven't the slightest inkling who has made such asses of you? Who has been playing the parson and the saint before your very eyes for months? It was Nosy Jim, you great apes. And Phillips and Moll, they are my 2 finest mates. By now, they are deep in the mountains with your gold. Hey, you there, drop it." His final words were barked at a restless miner, who instantly withered under the outlaw's savage glare and the steady bore of his revolver. In an hour, they will be safe from any pursuit. My advice to you is not to make matters worse by trying to follow us, unless you care to lose something far more precious than your dust. My horse is tethered at the door behind me. When the time is up, I shall step through that door, lock it from the outside, and take my leave. After that, you may crawl out as best you can. I have nothing more to say to you, except that you are the greatest herd of booted jackasses I have ever set eyes upon. The 60 long minutes that followed gave us ample time to mentally agree with his blunt assessment of our character. Before such a resolute and desperate villain, we were powerless. Of course, had we all charged him at once, we might have overwhelmed him at the cost of 8 or 10 of our lives. But how does one organize such a charge without the means to whisper a word? And who would dare to lead it, not knowing if the others would follow? We had no choice but to submit. It felt as though 3 hours had passed by the time the bandit finally snapped his watch shut. He stepped down from the barrel, never lowering his weapon, and backed toward the door before slipping quickly out of the saloon. We heard the screech of a rusty lock and the thunder of hooves as the outlaw galloped out of the Gulch. I mentioned before that for several weeks, profanity had been a rarity in our camp. In the next half hour, we made up for lost time. I have never in my life heard such exquisite and heartfelt swearing. By the time we finally managed to heave the door off its hinges, the bandits and their loot had vanished without a trace. We were never to see those villains, nor our gold, ever again. Poor Woburn, who had remained true to his duty, was found with a bullet through his head on the threshold of the plundered warehouse. Jackman's Gulch eventually recovered from the blow. Today, it is a thriving township. However, preachers and other moral reformers find very little business here. High virtues are just as unpopular. It is said that a judicial inquiry was recently held regarding a harmless stranger who had the misfortune to suggest that such a large settlement ought to have some form of church service. The footprints left in the memory of Jackman's Gulch by its one and only pastor are still far too fresh, and many long years must pass before they are ever washed away.